We are back. Thanks so much for your patience and attention this morning, folks. We've had a good couple of segments to begin with, and now we'll move into a perspective that's a little bit more upfront and immediate in terms of practicing using motivational interviewing. Our next presenter, Sharon Allen, is a licensed professional counselor and has been a behavioral health consultant at Virginia Garcia Memorial Health Center for the past 4 years. As a behaviorist, Sharon specializes in helping people change behaviors that impact their health, which can include addressing sleep, diet, physical activity, chronic pain, stress, you name it. She is still attempting her most difficult change yet, walking to the other side of the house to talk to other family members instead of shouting at them down the hall. Please join me in welcoming Sharon Allen.
Well, thank you. That had to be the most enthusiastic introduction I think I've ever gotten. Well, welcome. I am tasked with the project of bringing real-world examples into learning how to do motivational interviewing. And I'm going to start with just kind of some really practical pieces that I really want people to know, that if you have ever called a friend on the phone, the odds are that if you've listened to them talking to you about a problem, you know how to do this. That for many of us, the skills that are involved in motivational interviewing are pretty inherent to our day-to-day interactions, and they're not really something we have to learn. The trick is that I think people often want to know when to use them, and they're not always sure if they're doing motivational interviewing. So that's what I'm hoping that we can talk about today. I do have slides. It's going to be interesting to see if I can manage to navigate the move forward button and talking at the same time. That's probably going to be a little awkward, but we'll do our best. So let's see, ready? Pressing 1. Here we go. So I wanted to start with just some assumptions that I have about why we're all here. My assumptions are that we all want to do our best to provide good healthcare, whether you are a primary care provider, or more like me, where you are supporting people in primary care to help their patients as best as possible. I think we all get into this kind of a profession because we want to help, which means we want to do our best. If you are signed up for a training on motivational interviewing, I am assuming that you believe in collaboration. That one of the main ideas with motivational interviewing is that we aren't directing the person towards what we think they should do. Which means that we're really aiming to use more of a model of shared decision-making, of informed consent, which is part of why motivational interviewing fits so well with trauma-informed care, is because we're really looking at this idea of being a partner instead of being the boss. I am assuming that we do have knowledge, that sometimes we have knowledge our patients might not have, and that's okay. I'm also making the assumption that we use our knowledge to help involve our patient in making decisions about their lives rather than telling them what decision they should make. Something that we don't always talk about or don't always think about, I think, when we're talking about our patients, is that patients make decisions about what to do for their health from the context of where they're living in the moment. I think it's so easy sometimes to think about what we want our patients to do and what we think would be best for them, but we don't always have the whole picture. Or sometimes we have a pretty good idea of what the life is that they're living, but without really understanding, sometimes the process of advising can go really, really wrong. And the last assumption I'm making kind of stems from that, which is, if we aren't really taking the time to listen and understand our patients and where they're coming from and what fears they have and what it is they're trying to make for their lives, our own attempts to help may fall very, very short. And I'm going to ask you to think of a time when you maybe told somebody about a problem you were having, and you were hoping maybe for something that felt supportive as you did so, and maybe they responded with advice. And maybe you have more than one example of a time this has happened, but I want you to think about a time where the advice someone gave was really good, where it resonated, where it felt like they were really there with you. And then I want you to think about the other times. More often than not, I think when we get advice from other people, it falls into that second category where maybe it ends up being disappointing or alienating, rather than something that feels like help. And that's what I think we're aiming to avoid today, as we kind of talk about motivational interviewing, is how do we step into this role where we are consulting with the patient, where we're aiming to provide them with some new ways of doing something without it missing the mark and leaving them feeling misunderstood or more alone than they were, or worse, inferior to the person who's providing care. So that's where I'm coming from. Hopefully we're all on the same page. I know that the idea of collaborative care in primary care is still something that's a little bit challenging to navigate for a lot of people, and not often, I don't know that it's really taught in medical school. My understanding is it's not really a skill focused on. So what I do want to make sure then is that we give you guys, a really practical model for how to do that. Because most of what we're going to talk about in terms of when do I use interviewing, why do I use motivational interviewing, stems from that collaborative care model and how we want to interact with our patients. So we're going to talk a little bit about no-lose conflict resolution. I don't know that we consciously spend a lot of time thinking about this when we're interacting with patients, but a lot of the times when a patient comes to us with a concern, we're aiming to engage in no-lose conflict resolution. It might be that they come to us with a skin rash, and this might be very straightforward. You both look at the rash and they say, "Hey, I'm a little worried about this. What do you think it is?" And you might provide some feedback about what the concerns could be. And you talk a little bit about what you can do and decide on a course together. A lot of the times this process will be pretty straightforward, and it won't be a big deal. It won't require conflict resolution that is complex in any way. And sometimes this might even be considered being in the no problem area, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But sometimes it's not as straightforward. My guess is that you may have in your own memory a time when maybe a patient came to you and said, let's see, times that it comes up a lot for me would be times when people say things like, "My doctor won't give me pain medication. They just don't even believe that I'm in pain." Now we've got a pretty clear need for conflict resolution, because the thing that's coming up in the room is no longer straightforward, no longer task-oriented. And this comes up a lot. It can come up a lot with headaches. It can come, let's say, with headaches, the thing I hear the most is they're telling me that it's just headaches, and there's an underlying fear that it's a brain tumor. Or they're frustrated with any number of physical ailments or frustrations where someone feels like maybe the source is being downplayed, that the fact that there's not many tests being run, or that there's not a ton of diagnostic tools being used that they can see or understand, means that somebody doesn't care. So there are going to be times where we have to engage in this conflict resolution process. And it's often in that process that's really when we're really talking about motivational interviewing and why we need it. So I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page, because if we aren't talking about the idea of having these stages of conflict resolution that are really collaborative, that really are us working together with the patient, then it's going to be hard to know when we need to use motivational interviewing at all. So I think it's really important that we tie anything we're talking about back to the experiences we might have. And So I'm going to bring up some of these ones that I want you to check in with yourself about. I want you to take an honest minute to write down what you might say if a patient came to you and said the following. All right, the first scenario, diabetes sucks. Don't get me started on checking blood sugar. Essentially, what for? There's no point. It never makes a difference. My blood sugar is high anyways. Why should I even bother? I'm not going to deal with it anymore. Scenario 2. How come other people get pain medications and I don't? No one understands how hard this is for me. It's like they don't even care. And I never used to feel like this, but now I just can't seem to get myself to do anything. It's hard to just get out of bed. I want you to take a minute and write down what your response might be. Don't be afraid to be honest, okay? Because that's not actually, if we aren't really clear about what we would say, it's gonna be really hard to figure out what we want to change. And as you do this, we're going to come back to these responses in a bit. So I don't want you to just toss them or throw them away. I want you to actually keep them around. So I want you to hold that response and maybe put them to the side for a minute, because the first thing we have to figure out when someone comes to us is, do we have a problem? Now, that might sound pretty silly because it may be pretty obvious that we do, or it may be pretty obvious that we don't. But whether or not there's a problem, we have to figure out whose problem it is. So sometimes this is really, really straightforward. And I will use some kid examples, actually. I have a 6-year-old son, and so he makes these really nice and straightforward a lot of the time. If he comes to me and says, you know, Mom, it is so unfair. We got all this candy for Halloween, and it's like it's for nothing. It just sits there on the shelf. The very first thing we have to do is figure out who has the problem, because depending on who owns the problem, our response is going to be very different. Now, in this case, the person who's upset is not me. This is not my problem. I don't own this problem. The person who's upset is my child. And because he's the one who's upset and he is the one who owns the problem here, all of my responses are going to be aimed towards facilitating his ability to problem solve. So what does that translate to in interventions? That translates to active listening and reflection, which are 2 of the mainstays of motivational interviewing. So that might sound like, wow, yeah, we have a lot of candy and you're not getting to eat it. Sounds like that really bothers you. And allowing him to then proceed with whatever his concerns are, allowing him to disclose whatever he needs to, in order to then problem solve for himself or feel like he's been heard. Alternatively, we can end up owning a problem too. So an example of that would be recently my child has started pushing the limits around bedtime. He would definitely like to stay up later and later. And that has led to some sleep distracting activities around bedtime. And I've noticed that I get really frustrated and irritated. The thing is that while I would like his behavior to be different, the person who owns the problem there is me. I'm the one who's irritated. He'd be just as happy to keep going. And so it's really on my end that I need to address the issue at hand through confronting, through setting limits, through expressing my own concerns, which comes out in I statements, and we can talk about those at a different point. But the main issues are, in terms of when do we use motivational interviewing, really stems from those times when the patient owns the problem. It is possible to not have a problem. So if we don't have a problem, the situation would be something along the lines of, again, with my kid, he says, "Hey mom, do you want to play a game?" And I say, "Yeah, sure." No problem there, right? I mean, pretty straightforward. We're both task oriented. Now, in a medical appointment, that might sound more like, "Hey, I came in to establish care and I just need someone to check me out." Again, at least at face value, there's no problem necessarily stated. It's just a case of, okay, so we're gonna work together to get that done. When you look back at these scenarios, the first thing that I want you to notice is who owns these problems. Because depending on who owns the problem, we change our response. In this case, all three examples are situations that the patient owns the problem. They are the one who's frustrated or, frustrated, feeling unhappy, feeling unsatisfied, and who has the complaint, which means that our job is to actually not fix the problem, but to facilitate their discussion and then figure out how to collaboratively work together. So I found this cartoon while I was working on these slides, and it's actually perfect, right? That maybe don't say this one out loud, but I love that this provider can actually recognize that the good news is that it's not my problem. A little irreverent maybe, but it really actually does speak to the idea that the problems that our patients come in with are problems that belong to them. And that we want to match our response to that, to express and care that we know that they are the ones who have the problem. And if that sounds really strange to you, again, I want you to think about a time when maybe you felt upset by something and the responses that you had if you express that to somebody else. Many of times we might have this experience with our partners or with other friends where we share with them a problem that we have, and the response that we get actually stems from discomfort letting people have their own problems, that sometimes people step in with advice or directing how to solve the problem, or reassuring someone that things are going to be just fine. And again, while these things seem straightforward in the moment, a lot of them convey that the problem that we're having is uncomfortable to them, or that they don't think we should have it at all. And long term, that can really damage whether or not we share with them, whether or not we disclose freely with them, and in turn can limit the relationship. This may not seem like such a big deal, except for all the research that's out there that says that what works when we're talking about medical care to keep patients involved, to keep them following through on treatment plans, to make sure that they're more likely to follow the recommendations that we have, is the relationship. That without that, oftentimes that's where the damage starts to happen, that leads to people not participating in their own care and to not following through on the things that we would want for them. So this concept of problem ownership actually ends up being really important. Things that might make it hard. One, if you're somebody who's uncomfortable with the concept of sitting with other people's distress, it can be really, really, really difficult to let somebody else own a problem. And I'm thinking about, this happens a lot with kids, right? We went over to visit some friends at one point, and I think my kid maybe bonked his knee or something like that, and he was notably upset because his knee hurt. And the attempt was to distract him from noticing the pain, that it was a case of they actually kind of took on the ownership of the problem and responded by trying to divert his attention from it. And for better or for worse, we raised my kid using these kind of the parenting version of some of these ideas. And he looked at us like, "What is that weirdo doing, trying to distract me from this? I hurt, man. What's wrong with them?" Which thankfully was reassuring to me that we're actually doing something pretty well right, that he he was upset. He knew he was upset, and he was happy to protest his injury and then be done. And that distracting him from it actually didn't feel good to him, but also was foreign. And I'm hoping that long term we can manage to provide that to most of our patients. So we kind of covered a little bit of this already, that motivational interviewing is essentially the approach that we use when the patient owns the problem. It's been around a while now. And we use it like it's this magic word, right? Like, you're going to do motivational interviewing and it's going to be this incredible intervention, which I think is part of where it gets so intimidating for people. People think to themselves, oh my gosh, motivational interviewing, that's like, sweet buzzword there. But in the end, again, most of us are doing these things that collectively are motivational interviewing all the time. It's part of how we make and keep friends. It's part of how we build good relationships with our colleagues. So the skills are almost always guaranteed to be there. It's about learning to name what you're doing. Honestly, a lot of times when I have beginning counseling students, we talk a lot about how intuitively they know what they need to do. It's about learning to name what they did as an intervention, and recognize that they were doing it, rather than trying to think about what intervention to use. And I'd like to invite you guys to hold that attitude here. The thing that can be most distracting, I think, when we go into an exam room or go to talk to someone, is when we're so focused on what do I need to do, or what's the intervention I need to use, or how do I do that intervention, that we forget to be there with the person. But more often than not, if we can allow ourselves to be present and allow ourselves to be curious, the skills of motivational interviewing follow. But just a reminder, what are those skills? Collaboration, active listening, open-ended questions, reflection, and my personal favorite, exploration of resistance. I'm probably the only person in the world who, well, thankfully I'm not, but I always feel a little bit strange when people have been referred to me for tobacco cessation, and my response to the patient is, I'm sorry, but I don't think you're ready yet. That, they're telling me all the things that all these pieces about how other people are telling them they should quit and such forth. And it's so interesting to bring that conversation around to, okay, but what about you? Do you want to quit? I hear what everyone else is saying, and if you don't want to quit, tell me more. I want to know about that part of you. I want to know about the part of you that says, heck no, I don't want to give this up. Because oftentimes, if we don't know more about that, we really can't make any other kind of plan, and we really can't intervene. And sometimes the very step of saying to somebody, hey, that part of you that doesn't want to do this matters too, is what allows them to go, okay, if we hold up everything they're feeling, that's when they can start to problem solve for themselves and to start to build their own path forward. So the thing that's different about motivational interviewing than a lot of other things is that the goal we have is to enable the patient to start to speak their own self-motivational statements. We know that the things that we say ourselves have more power than the things that other people say to us, right? Okay. When I am upset, I often will talk to myself in the car. I will highly recommend, by the way, that you do this with a British accent. It really makes it quite enjoyable. And it turns out that sometimes just saying things out loud, right? Using using what you hear of your own voice as a sounding board allows for incredible problem solving. That's why sometimes it's so great to actually just have a friend that we can just, disclose whatever concerns we have to, who can sit and listen. That in the process of doing that, sometimes we hear ourselves and have that moment of like, oh, hold on a second, this isn't as bad as I thought it would be. Or I just heard myself come up with a solution. Hold on, let me go try that. And so that's really where we're aiming for with these skills is, how do we facilitate a person in coming up with their own solutions? How do we facilitate somebody saying, I do want to do that. It turns out I do want to be more physically active, or whatever it might be. So long ago, you'll see a lot of these slides from at the bottom. They're from a book called Making the Patient Your Partner by Thomas Gordon. Full disclosure, I love Thomas Gordon. He is one of my very favorite writers, and has written some of the best parenting. Back in the 80s, he came up with the idea of parent effectiveness training. It's still one of the better programs out there for aiding parents to really learn how to navigate relationships with their children. So you can imagine my excitement when, in the process of trying to translate some of his ideas into medicalese, or whatever you want to call it, I realized he'd already done it. So I wanted to bring some of these ideas of his, though, forward. And a lot of what we're talking about is the idea of problem ownership is from Thomas Gordon. The idea of kind of matching your reaction and your intervention to the problem ownership is straight out of his. But so are these 12 roadblocks of communication. And if you've done much reading on motivational interviewing, some of these will probably seem familiar, because there has been a connection between the work of Thomas Gordon, and actually he was a contemporary of Carl Rogers. And so a lot of these things all come together, right? Just time and space. So he has this idea of the 12 roadblocks of communication, and some of them probably won't seem particularly obvious, which is why I want you to go back now to those scenarios that we were looking at. And I want you to see if any of your responses match the roadblocks, because many of us, it's really easy to step into these different responses, myself included. I misstep still, and probably will for the rest of my career, somewhat regularly. And that happens. And it's a really great practice to start recognizing what was the response we gave that was such a misstep. So now some of these probably seem like pretty obvious roadblocks, that if you criticize someone in terms of when they tell you about a problem, and your response is to criticize them with, well, duh, that was super stupid of you, they're probably not going to keep wanting to talk to you. But some of them are probably less obvious. Especially if you're in the role of medical provider, it can seem like part of your job is to direct care. So, if somebody tells you about a problem and you respond with, well, you need to do this, that might seem like it's pretty in line with what your role is to provide. And the problem becomes really this idea of down the road, how that can inhibit disclosure, and how some of these things are actually great things that we can do. We can end up in the role of advising a patient, and that's not a bad thing. But that if we don't facilitate enough disclosure early on, we're going to end up making those missteps. So part of what we really want to do is to make sure that when the patient is telling us about a problem, when they're expressing distress to us, when they're doing all these things that say, hey, I'm really struggling here, that we're really staying in the role of facilitating disclosure. So, criticizing, shaming others, moralizing, those all probably seem like pretty straightforward. Well, of course I wouldn't do that. That's rude. Some of the ones that are maybe less obvious would be praising. When you tell a patient, hey, that was great. One of the side effects of praise is actually that it makes people realize that sometimes you judge them negatively. And so while you may be judging them positively in that moment, it can also be a reminder that long-term, you won't. And that they may become a little bit more hesitant to share things that won't bring about, praise that's anticipated. Reassuring kind of falls into that same situation, that it can, if we're telling people, hey, you're really going to be okay. Again, it doesn't seem like a harmful thing in the moment, but the challenge is that if we reassure someone, one, it actually can leave them dependent on our reassurance. And two, it conveys that their problem isn't really that important to us. We don't think it's that big a deal, which can be really, really at odds with how they feel about their problem. And again, if there's that disconnect there, people are going to stop sharing. When they stop sharing, we can't do very good work because we aren't really able to use the full knowledge that we have, and the knowledge of how to match that to the patient's needs. Warning. Okay, so this is probably one that, again, like, may not seem like such a bad thing if somebody has super high blood sugars and we say, well, if we don't get those under control, you're going to have, you're going to lose a toe. Again, that may be true. That may be information that is accurate. But again, if the patient's coming in and they're telling you about how upset they are and how frustrated they are, that's a mismatch that may shut them down pretty quickly. So this is the last slide I have, and then I definitely want to pop into some maybe more case examples. So why is this a face palm? I have heard this phrase said to me more than once by more than one person. You would have been so proud of me. I used my motivational interviewing today. To which, as a behaviorist, my thought was, ooh, because this isn't usually something we slip in and out of. It's really an attitude, and it's in the ideal world, it's an attitude that we bring to every single appointment we have, that we're there to listen, to collaborate, to be part of that experience for the patient of solving their own problems when they can. But also, if we are anticipating that they're going to make changes in their lives, whether that be the change of going to get the the imaging done that we're requesting of them, whether that's the request to make changes to their diet, or if it's sleep that you're saying, hey, I'd like you to make some changes to go see the behaviorist and talk through ways to improve your sleep. Anytime we're hoping that somebody's going to make changes, if we're stepping into this role in the moment, we probably aren't carrying what we call the spirit of motivational interviewing with us, right? Because in the true spirit of motivational interviewing, we go into appointments open-minded, curious, unsure of where this will go. And sometimes hearing that maybe the thing that the patient wants isn't the same thing that we want, and being willing to learn more, being willing to hear them out, being willing to understand where that resistance is coming from, and at the same time being able to then flex and figure out where to go from there. My experience has been that this statement comes up the most, and I'm just putting a name on it now, when the problem is actually owned by the provider. And by that I mean, we can end up stepping into the role of motivational interviewing and turning it on like, here goes my motivational interviewing switch, when what happens is we walk into an appointment and we end up uncomfortable, that the patient says something that for us just leaves us feeling really unsure. And in that way, if we're turning motivational interviewing on, then it sort of is almost exactly counter to what we're really talking about, that in true motivational interviewing, right, we don't have the agenda, or at least any agenda we have gets put aside when we're interacting with our patient. And in this case, if we're going in and turning it on when maybe the patient says something that we're uncomfortable with, or we didn't like, or we would like them to do differently, we're not really open-minded and agenda-free, are we? And so I wanted to hold this up here as just, if part of what you end up feeling is that you're turning on motivational interviewing on and off, it says to me that, well, that the skill set might be there, right? The active listening, or it might be that you're doing a really great job of reflecting, but that we need to come back to the how, that those are the whats of motivational interviewing. The active listening, the reflection, the ability to honor the resistance and maybe even explore it. But the how matters at least as much, if not more, which is to go into an appointment putting your own agenda aside, even if you know what would cure a physical ailment or would improve things, is the ability to say, okay, I'm going to put that over here for now, and I'm going to find out what this person really needs, what it is they're looking for, in order to then proceed. I want to give a few case examples, and I definitely want to also, I'm realizing one of the questions that might come up for folks is, well, if I'm doing all this, how do I actually share my expertise, or how do I share the knowledge that I have, or how do I make sure that my patients are informed of the options that they have? And so I wanted to put this out there, that when the stylistic choice that you can make in those moments is to ask, hey, could I share something with you? And that's when you know that the person has facilitated, when all of their emotional needs have been met, and that you have really listened and they have really been able to disclose all the different things that they're concerned about. Sometimes that's the moment where we can actually say, we can reflect back to them. Here's how I'm hearing what's going on for you. And I'm wondering if you'd be open to discussing what to do next. Or I'm wondering if you feel ready for some information about how we might treat this. So it's not that we don't want to, that we want to honor the knowledge that comes into the room from providers as much as the emotions and feelings that come into the room from a patient. The key is the timing, and the key is making sure that the responses we have are acknowledging whether there's a problem in the room. If so, who owns that problem, and then kind of moves forward from there. So that is why I included this slide. I just want people to take a minute to be able to recognize times where maybe we put on our motivational interviewing hat and take it off. And I guess I'm encouraging people to leave that hat on more of the time, in order to make it something that you don't have to think about, and you don't have to wonder if you used it. So I wanted to be able to spend some time just thinking a little bit about recent case examples. I've been collecting these over the last few days when I've been talking to patients. And I actually, one of the cool things is I've had several different recent experiences doing evaluations for chronic pain, which actually I think are really cool because they lend so much to talking about this, especially comparing one to the other. So I just wanted to share how this comes up and where it starts. So in all these cases, the person was either currently on opiate medications or would like to start opiate medications. And so the reason for the appointment in all these cases was really to talk about assessing for risk of misuse. But one of the things I love is also getting to start sharing that idea that behavioral interventions, psychological interventions can be super effective in managing chronic pain. And so a lot of these conversations are a little bit mixed in terms of both evaluation, but also starting to offer this additional idea that there are some other things that we can do. So every single phone call, right? Like at this point, I have not seen a patient face-to-face since March. And part of what I'm thinking about is, in the name of motivational interviewing, in the name of trauma-informed care, and via telemedicine, every single appointment really starts with, who am I? And making sure that the patient knows that it is a choice, that they can either talk to me or not. That sometimes people aren't necessarily expecting my call, although I'm not always sure how that happens. That sometimes they felt maybe pressured to participate in a call with me. And so I always want to make it really clear, like here's who I am. I don't think I'm terribly scary. I will admit that I like to make sure people know that. That what I like to make sure that they know what I'm anticipating to do for the day, right? Like, hey, I'm gonna ask you some questions about the pain you've been experiencing, and looking for patterns for what makes it better and for worse, and what makes it something that you cope with better and worse. And I'm also going to get a small snapshot of your life because I want to know a little bit about who you are and what's important to you and what matters. And I like to always make sure that I start with, and that's going to take, 20 to 30 minutes. And after that, we're going to put our heads together. We're going to figure out a plan for what we should do. And why go through all that? I mean, it's like a 3-minute intro out of a 20-minute appointment. Like, what's the point? Well, I want somebody to know straight off the bat that I'm hopefully someone they can feel comfortable with and disclose to. I want them to know what to expect for the appointment so that they also feel a sense of power, right? We're talking about how does this all fit with trauma-informed care? And the more that I can make sure that the patient is a participant and not just somebody who is there on the other end of the phone, the better. And the other thing I really like to communicate up front is like, I'm not doing this by myself. Like, we're going to put our heads together. I don't want to tell you what to do without some feedback. To make sure that whatever we come up with as a plan is something that is mutually agreed upon, that it's not just me directing this care. And I like to make sure that people know that if they want to protest, I am going to listen. And the next thing that we're listening to, right, if we think about like the presenting issue, really is the patient tell me about their problem. It's hey, I have been in pain since I was 10. And it's terrible and it's getting worse. Or I had a series of car accidents and ever since then, I've been experiencing these problems with my back. Or I do a lot of heavy labor and it seems like that's really taking a toll. My knees hurt all the time. And really, while sometimes I am asking closed-ended questions because 20 minutes is not a lot of time, and sometimes I can't just let things expand, there's a pretty good mix, right? Between, hey, tell me all about that. And I want to know more. And I want you to tell me exactly what it's like since I can't actually be in your body. I want to know, when's it happen? What do you do? What's it like when it happens? Mixed with the closed-ended questions of, when did this start? Which is a pretty, limited answer. Or have you tried this or have you tried that? One of the things that, we talk about active listening to facilitate people's disclosures, and very clearly when people have closed-ended questions, it sort of limits the disclosure, sometimes usefully so. But something I always want to kind of bring up is if you need to ask some closed-ended questions, it can be really helpful to just tell the person like, hey, I wish I could spend all day talking about this, but I have to get through a couple things real quick. Can I ask you a couple questions? Or if you're going to have to interrupt for something, to be able to say straight up, these appointments are super short. And I don't mean to be rude, but there might be a point at which I have to interrupt you in order to make sure that, we can both stay on track. And again, that's a way of taking what could be a roadblock, right? A roadblock of interrupting, which makes people look super unimportant or undervalued, or closed-ended questions, which says, hey, I don't really want to know that much. And instead takes those from being something that can convey that to being able to be something that's upfront. So one of the things I always think about is just making that super transparent so that people aren't left wondering, like, why is this person, all of a sudden acting really differently, or doesn't even care that I was trying to tell him something and now he's totally changing gears. So putting that out there. The other thing is listening for what is the problem here? Pain itself is pretty unpleasant. I think we can all be fairly agreed to that. And for most people, pain itself isn't the thing that is bothering them the most. So when I hear about, when I do these evaluations, a lot of times if I'm active listening, right, what I might be hearing is, oh, the pain hurts all the time. I never get a break and it's awful. And really, the longer they talk, what becomes more clear is that if I'm really reflecting back to them, what ends up coming out is not just the pain, but that they feel a loss of freedom because their mobility has changed, or there's a huge change in their identity and they're really grieving because they used to be able to do so many things and now it hurts and they're not sure if they can do those things again. A lot of times the problem really isn't the pain itself, but the fear that they aren't going to be able to enjoy life again. And in that way, the reflection, right? If I'm listening well, one of the things I always remember is that parrots can actually do really great, can do reflection. If what we expect out of a person doing reflection is to repeat words back, don't be a parrot. That if we're really taking in what somebody's saying as we listen and reflecting, part of what we're reflecting back isn't the words, it's the whole message that's encoded between their words, their body language, their tone of voice. We're reflecting back that whole picture of the whole message that we're getting. And in that way, helping people to feel understood, which then facilitates a whole lot of other interventions we can have. Over the phone, of course, that's a little bit more challenging. And if you were to listen in on a call, you'd hear a lot of me checking in to say, okay, it just got really quiet here. That could be because you accidentally hit mute on your phone, or that could be something I said really rubbed you the wrong way. I want to know. Tell me about that. Tell me what it is that you just, were reacting to. And I will kid you not, yesterday the response was, oh no, I was in the bathroom. To which I thought, okay, well, you get something new every day. But really checking in about, since we can't see the person's body language, since we can't see if there's a double message, right, between something that's distinct from what they're saying versus what we're really seeing, we have to really check out those guesses on our own and kind of check out the hypothesis that maybe there's something happening here that what they're saying doesn't quite match what we're hearing or feeling. So, checking that out is a big deal, but it's a really different problem to solve if the thing that somebody's upset about is, I'm worried that I won't ever be able to be the parent that I want to be because I'm having trouble with this pain. That's a pretty different problem to solve than I hate this pain and I want it to go away. And I think that's a really important reason for us to actually do that facilitating work, is because then when we're talking about what are the goals of treatment, what are the goals of care, it really helps for us to both be on the same page. Similarly, a lot of those times I end up having the conversation where I have the problem, sometimes because what the person is saying is, are you going to tell people that it's okay for me to have meds? To which it is on my end to say, I can't do that. I will tell you what I'm going to write in the evaluation, and I am transparent and I will share that with people because I think they have a right to know, but I'm not going to tell someone what's going to happen next in their treatment. What I will tell them is, what I will write in your report is, I think you have a low risk of misuse, or I'm concerned about the risk of misuse, whatever it might be. And in those moments where this comes up and there is a clear discomfort on my end, usually because somebody is asking me for something that I can't give them, is being able to say very clearly, from where I come from, I feel really bummed, but I can't do that. I'm going to put the whole concept of I statements on it has to be a back burner, because that's its own set of skills and really probably requires its own hour. But being able to do a good confrontation, the more that we're able to maintain a good do good confrontations when we need to, and active listening and facilitate when we need to. The cool thing is, over time, that actually, if we think about this idea of a problem like area, and above the problem area, everything that the patient's doing is totally acceptable to us, although it might not work for them. Below the problem area is stuff that they do that is not acceptable to us. We don't like it, but doesn't necessarily bother the patient. What we're looking at is that top section where it's acceptable to us, but they're expressing upset. That's really where it's their problem and they own it, and we're going to support them in talking about it. and the bottom part is where we own it. The cool thing is the more we do that, the bigger the no problem area gets. And when we're in that no problem area, I think that's kind of like, we think of it as like the dream zone, right? Like when you're in that no problem area, there's no problem. And instead you guys you can both be doing something task oriented, right? That's like the equivalent for me is somebody comes in and they're like, man, I really want to work on being more mobile with chronic pain. And we've talked about it and we're on the same page, and we know that we're both going to work on helping them to learn how to pace themselves better, because as they've been super underactive for a long time, their body is having a really hard time being deconditioned. But there's no problem because they're not upset about anything. I'm not upset about anything. We come together and we work. We figure out what their baseline is. We figure out where, what the internal barriers are when they try and pace themselves, that say, oh, I can't pace myself. I'm feeling good today. I got to do all the things I got to do right now. Or the part of them that says, oh, I'm not feeling good. I don't want to do anything, and sticks to that. And we make a plan for how to implement. There's no problem. And usually in those moments, that's when I hear someone say, oh, I had a day of straightforward patients. What I bet I'm hearing is, I had a bunch of patients where we were in the no problem zone. And for those patients where it's more complex, the more that we can use active listening, and the more that we can stay in that place of reflection and keep them owning their own problems, but keep them working on those problems, talking about them, thinking about them. And the more that we can, when we own the problem, also stay in that role of like, I own this and I got to tell somebody about it. I can't just sit here and fume. The bigger and bigger that no problem zone is going to get, which is like, I think kind of like searching for the holy grail of doing appointments, that all of a sudden we're in this nice, straightforward, easy spot where the work is, let's do this thing that you got to do. Let's do, let's make a plan for imaging, or let's make a plan for sleep hygiene, or whatever it might be, but it's straightforward and easy to do. So I'm looking forward to answering questions. I'm sure there are probably many, because I know that sometimes I can speak in a bit of a roundabout way. Yeah, I'm looking forward to responding.